Hello, welcome. Thank you for joining me. We are going to be reading a passage from Numbers 13. We're going to be reading verses 25 to 33 and then talking about them a little bit. So let's jump right into it, shall we? After exploring the land for 40 days, the men returned to Moses, Aaron, and the whole community of Israel at Kadesh in the wilderness of Paran. They reported to the whole community what they had seen and showed them the fruit that they had taken from the land. This was what their report to Moses said. "We entered the land you sent us to and explored, and it is indeed a bountiful country, a land flowing with milk and honey. Here is the kind of fruit it produces. But the people living there are powerful, and their towns are large and fortified. We even saw giants there, the giants of Anak. The Amalekites live in Negev, and the Hittites and Jebusites and Amorites live in the hill country, and the Canaanites live along the coast of the Mediterranean Sea and along the Jordan Valley." But Caleb tried to quiet the people and stood there before Moses. "Let's go at once to take the land. We can certainly conquer it." But the other men who explored the land disagreed with him. "We can't go up against them. They're stronger than we are." And so they spread this bad report about the land among the Israelites. "The land we traveled through and explored will devour anyone who goes to live there. All the people we saw were huge. We even saw giants there and the descendants of Anak. Next to them, we felt like grasshoppers, and that's what they thought too." When I was younger, I had thought it was completely insane that the Israelites wouldn't just walk into the promised land. I mean, it was right there, and they talk about being afraid. But they had just seen the strongest culture in our known history, one of them at least, be completely taken down by their God. I mean, there were plagues, and they watched literal ocean part, and they walked across on dry land only to have that ocean come back together behind them and crush their enemies. They were led by a pillar of clouds and a pillar of fire, and there was literal bread that came down from heaven to keep them nourished. And they had all of this, and they were still too afraid to just walk in. And I couldn't understand it until something happened to me this week that reminded me of something I did as a kid. Or at least a high schooler. See, in high school, the musical for my sophomore year was my favorite musical from my childhood. And I had been so excited to audition for it. I was sure I was going to get a great part. I had told my teacher, I was like, "I love this musical. I have had it memorized since I was a kid. My teacher told me before summer break, I look forward to seeing your audition. I really want to have you be a lead next year." And I was so sure that everything was going to work out great. And I went through my audition, and the audition went really well, and then I got my call back, and it wasn't quite the part that I had hoped for, but it was a named part in the musical. It was a small lead. And the first week of school came, and I was connecting with friends, and the audition was on my mind, but rehearsing just kind of fell to the background. I didn't really practice. I was sure that I had it down, and I had all these other things that I could focus on. And so I didn't really rehearse, even though I had people who were there ready to practice with me. I had everything going for me. And then I got to the callback, and I got so nervous and scared, staring at all these people who were looking at me. All of these people who wanted me to succeed. But I was so afraid of being judged. And I totally sucked. I mean, I completely destroyed myself. I couldn't remember the words. I was singing off key. Everything fell apart in the middle of this audition. And I was so upset. Now, I still got to be a part of the play. I got to be a part of the ensemble. But after that audition, my teacher walked up to me and said, what happened? I thought you knew everything so well. And I said, I did. I don't know. But the truth is I did know. Because I didn't practice. I didn't just step in and take my blessing. And because of that, I still got to be a part of it, but it was not the blessing that I had been handed. All but handed. Because I couldn't reach out and do that little bit of work to take the next step, because I got scared and distracted, I couldn't come in to that next part. I couldn't receive the blessing that I had been all but promised. And part of that fear comes because the year before, when I had auditioned, I once again hadn't practiced very much, and I had come from this past of being pretty much the best in class and gotten leads every time I'd done a musical from the time I was in kindergarten. And so I walked in my freshman year and had not even gotten an ensemble part. You'd think I'd learn from my mistakes and start rehearsing, but that didn't come until much later in life, because unfortunately I was a teenager and thus I was dumb. Looking at the Israelites, they're looking at the reality of their situation, the facts in front of them, and they're scared. They just took down a giant in the form of Israel, or, well, at least their God did for them. And they're too scared to take that step into their next blessing. The funny thing is, if you actually look up some of the history, you find out that this wasn't even all of the Israelites. In fact, it wasn't even most of the Israelites. 80% of the Israelite population stayed in Egypt because they were too afraid to leave. So these are the bravest that Israel has to offer. And it was the leaders of the tribes that went in, with the exception of the Levites, who had to stay behind with Moses. They were so afraid because of what was in front of them. And at the end of the passage, it says that they spread a report that wasn't entirely true. Now, was it? In the start of the verses, we see them talking about how the land is lush and fertile and so full of life. But it's scary. It's got big people. And then at the end, it says this land will devour anyone who goes to live there. So they started lying to themselves. That's not really as nice as I think it is. It's not really as good as I think it is. And they started looking at the facts in front of them instead of the God above them. If you dig a little deeper into some of the history, in fact, it seems like they got a little caught up in their history. They were looking at themselves as slaves instead of children of God. They got so caught up in their past pain that they couldn't see their past blessings or the blessings that were in front of them. And so they couldn't just reach out and do that next step in order to claim their blessing. And one of them, Caleb, and we find out in the next chapter, Joshua, said, "No, we can do this." And how many times have we as people gotten caught up in our past so much that we can't go forward? How many blessings and relationships have we gotten ruined because we couldn't let go of the past and accept the power of the healing that we've gotten as Christians, as believers in God? How many times did we have everything going for us, and all we had to do was one tiny little thing, like practice our lines? God is always rooting for us. God always has our best intentions at heart. Let's talk a little bit about some of the history of these people, shall we? Because the Israelites say that the people of the land looked at them and thought that they looked like grasshoppers. Now, if you actually research, you find out that that wasn't entirely true, because the people of the land had just found out that these were the people who had pretty much destroyed all of the Egyptian troops, and they were terrified of the Israelites. But if you go back even further, you can chart that a couple of these people had been afraid of the Israelites since the beginning. Since the very start. Since the time of Abraham. You see, the Jebusites had actually been on that land when Abraham and Lot came through, and Abraham gave Lot the valley and took the mountain for himself. A harsher land, to be certain. And Abraham had talked to the Jebusites, and the Jebusites had made a deal with Abraham. They said, "We know that your descendants are supposed to kick us off of this land and drive us out, as according to your God, we will be handed over to you. So we want you to make a covenant that you will not fully drive us out of this land, that we get to stay here. Because we know that this is going to be your descendants' land, but we like this spot. It's our spot." And so the Jebusites had a covenant with Abraham that they were not going to be driven out when the descendants of Abraham, the Israelites, came to eventually claim their blessing. And as a result, the Jebusites were actually never fully driven out of Israel. And then you have the definition of some of these names. I think I'd like to talk about what those people represent. Because when you define Hittite, their name means to deplete of strength, courage, willpower, or any essential support, which results in a sort of collapse. The Hittites, by existing as warriors, were people that the Israelites came into contact with and lost all confidence. These were people who worshipped nature. They were known as a pagan nation. And if you look at witchcraft, you find out that witchcraft is trying to do everything in your own power. Your own personal strength or the strength of nature and creation, as opposed to relying on God. They also mean fear. The Jebusites' name, when you define it, means the condition of being downtrodden, of being pushed down and walked over. These were people that should have been able to be walked over, but the Israelites couldn't do it because they were so concentrated on all of the big things around them. The Ammonites, their name means the wringing of hands. Sort of a nervous gesture. The Ammonites were actually, in the Bible, children of Lot's daughter. They came about through some sketchy interactions. If you want to look that up a little bit, I suggest you do it, but I will not be sharing that right now. But they are actually relations of the Israelites. Lot himself was actually blessed, but his daughters made poor choices, and because of that, they created the nations of the Moabites and the Ammonites, enemies of the Israelites. All of these people had histories with the Israelites and knew their blessings. And they were afraid. And all the Israelites had to do was walk in and take the land. But just like me, they didn't want to go over their lines. They got distracted by all the things in front of them, and they wouldn't take that next step. They got caught up in the history of who they had been, slaves pushed down, downtrodden, these people who are so scary, roar. The Israelites looked at these individuals in front of them and said, I'm too afraid of you to walk in, when the people in front of them were terrified and ready to be handed over. And because of that, their blessing was less. And it took them 40 years to get it. So, what does this mean for us? Well, go over your lines. But look over the moments in your life where you're not doing something because you're afraid of it. Look over the moments in your life where you're not walking into your next season because there's 1,000 things that you can list as to why you shouldn't do it because there's people standing in front of you, but God says you should. Now, I'm not saying that every moment that you're afraid is something that you should just walk into. Fear is there for a reason. But if you pray about it, and you know that that's your blessing, and it's been earmarked for you, and all you have to do is one thing that maybe isn't fun, or maybe means taking a part of yourself and getting rid of it, healing it, letting it go, finding a new identity in Christ so that you can walk into your next season. Do that thing. Because all the Israelites had to do was walk through the gates. All I had to do was read a few lines. So maybe if we stop letting our past get in our way, we can walk through into the season we're meant to live in. Thank you.